Today in Washington, D.C., the president's campaign chairman was back in federal court. His legal team was back in court on his behalf. Paul Manafort himself elected not to come to court personally today. He instead stayed home. His new home for the last several months now, of course, has been the federal jail in Alexandria, Virginia. After what has just been a remarkable week in the courts this week, which started with prosecutors in the special counsel's office declaring that Paul Manafort had been lying to them, saying he was in breach of his cooperation agreement. The president's lawyers then bragging publicly that they'd been using Paul Manafort as a way to gather intelligence on what the special counsel was up to in the Russia investigation. Manafort had been secretly informing the White House about his interactions with prosecutors since he supposedly became their cooperating witness. After all that this week, what we learned today about Manafort in court is that he's not actually going to be sentenced until March 5th, which means a lot more time at home. His current home, which is jail. That said, next week, a week from today, the special counsel's office says that they will turn into the court in Manafort's case. They're going to submit their detailed accounting of how exactly Manafort has been lying to them, how he breached his cooperation agreement with them. This week, between the Manafort explosion and the Michael Cohen guilty plea about Trump Tower Moscow yesterday, we have already had quite the rollout this week from the special counsel's office about what they've got and who else should be worried about the evidence that Robert Mueller and his team have assembled. Well, now we know, as of this court appearance today, that at the end of next week, next Friday, a week from today, we're going to get a big new dose of that as it pertains to Paul Manafort, the president's jailed campaign chairman. But here's the thing. Even before then, on Tuesday, we're going to get yet more, because on Tuesday of next week, that's the deadline for Mueller's prosecutors to file their memorandum in aid of sentencing for Michael Flynn. Mike Flynn is, of course, the first national security advisor to President Trump. He pled guilty last year to lying to federal investigators about his contacts with the Russian government, contacts in which he discussed the possible lifting of U.S. sanctions against Russia. Next week, on Tuesday, we are going to get a whole new narrative from Mueller's office about Flynn's crime, his cooperation or lack thereof, and anything else they want to share, because they believe it will be of relevance to what kind of sentence he's going to ultimately end up getting. And it sort of couldn't come at a better time, because all of a sudden, now, this week, we, the public, just got a much clearer and, frankly, much more worrying view of the crime that Mike Flynn pled to, and maybe even why he might have done it. So I think this is worth sort of focusing on pretty intently, not only in terms of sort of buttoning up what we learned over the course of this week, but what's about to come next. We know that more shoes are going to drop. We know we're going to get a bunch more information from the special counsel's office in the next few days. Focus in on this Flynn thing just for a second. Mike Flynn had some unusual Russia ties during the campaign, right? He had visited Russia at the Russian government's behest, just as Trump was declaring his run for president. Soon after he got back from Russia, he signed up to join Trump's campaign, which was a surprise. Mike Flynn had been a registered Democrat. It later emerged that Mike Flynn not only sat with Vladimir Putin at a gala event on that Russia trip, he also led a standing ovation for the Russian president at that gala event. He was also paid by the Russian government to attend that event. They paid all expenses for him and his son, and then they paid him a pretty good fee on top of that. Flynn initially denied it, but it was all later proven out, and then he admitted it. Then in the presidential transition after Trump won, Flynn, as the designated national security advisor for the incoming administration, he contacted the Russian government multiple times to talk to them about U.S. government sanctions against Russia, to encourage Russia at one point not to retaliate against new measures that were taken against Russia by the Obama administration in response to Russia messing with our election. Flynn is the guy who called them and said, basically, don't hit back, don't worry. Trump's going to be in there soon, I'm going to be in there soon, and then you won't have anything to worry about. We're going to take care of all the sanctions. That's what the FBI and federal prosecutors came to know that Mike Flynn had done. But he lied about it publicly at the time. He denied that he was having any such conversations. And then he apparently lied to the FBI about it when they came calling about it, too. That's what he ended up pleading guilty to. And we're going to learn more about that on Tuesday, finally, in open court. But there's always been something kind of hard to figure out about the Flynn case. And this has been a real point of focus for critics of the Mueller investigation on the right. And I don't know how they're going to answer what we've now learned about this situation, but we now have a much better understanding of what happened here, right? The big question about Flynn, and this has in particular been raised over and over again by critics of the Mueller prosecution, big question. Why did Mike Flynn lie about this stuff? I mean, he was the designated incoming national security advisor. It was a little weird. It's potentially a Logan Act violation for the incoming national security advisor to be calling a federal government, a foreign government, undermining existing U.S. policy and the existing U.S. president. It's a little weird, but the Logan Act has never actually been used to prosecute anybody. And given that Flynn wasn't just some average private citizen, given that he really was the incoming national security advisor, it would be a little weird, but it wouldn't be that weird for him to be making those kinds of calls with Russia. Policy is about to change. Consider that when you're measuring what your response should be to this latest action from the lame duck outgoing president. I mean, it's a little weird. It's not that weird. But for some reason, Mike Flynn felt like he was doing something with those calls that could not come out. For some reason, he felt like he was doing something that really needed to be secret. And it wasn't just him. That's how they all were on this issue of Russian sanctions. You might remember K.T. McFarland. She was a Fox News pundit. And then for a hot minute, she became the top deputy at the National Security Council under Mike Flynn. Thanks to New York Times reporting on the internal communications of the Trump transition at the time, we know that K.T. McFarland was in on what Flynn was doing in these calls to Russia. She knew he was talking to the Russian government about lifting sanctions. But nevertheless, she lied about it too. She lied about it famously to the Senate under oath, which scuttled her chances of becoming an ambassador. That's what they tried to do with her after Flynn had to resign and then he pled guilty. But, you know, in terms of K.T. McFarland and her lying about this Russian sanctions discussion, reporters Shane Harris and Devlin Barrett at the Washington Post had this remarkable piece about her back in September. And it didn't get that much attention at the time, but it now turns out, I think, to be pretty important. In that piece in the Washington Post in September, we learned that not only did K.T. McFarland lie to the Senate about those conversations with Russia about sanctions, she lied to the FBI about those conversations, too. Quote, a former top White House official, K.T. McFarland, has revised her statement to investigators about a key event in the probe of Russian interference in the 2016 election. When FBI agents first visited K.T. McFarland at her Long Island home in the summer of 2017, McFarland denied ever talking to Mike Flynn about any discussion of sanctions between him and the Russian ambassador during the presidential transition. For a time, investigators saw her answers as inconsistent, putting her in legal peril as the FBI tried to determine whether she had lied to them. Not long after Flynn's guilty plea, McFarland was questioned by investigators again about her conversations with Flynn. And in that subsequent conversation with investigators, she walked back her previous denial that sanctions were discussed. Quote, eventually McFarland and her lawyer convinced the FBI that she hadn't intentionally misled the Bureau. She had rather spoken from memory without the benefit of any documents that could have helped her remember the exchanges with Flynn. Quote, Mueller's team appears to be satisfied with K.T. McFarland's revised account, according to people familiar with the probe. Okay, but here's the amazing thing. So K.T. McFarland told the FBI, no, we didn't talk to Russia about sanctions, even though they did. Then Flynn pleads guilty to lying to the FBI about talking to Russia about sanctions. After Flynn pleads guilty, she goes back and tells the eye, oh, wait, sanctions? Is that what you were talking about? I am so sorry. I plumb forgot. But now I remember, yeah, I think we probably did talk to the Russians about sanctions. I'm so sorry. And the FBI decided not to charge her because they believed her that she just forgot. Here's the next line in that remarkable story from Shane Harris and Devlin Barrett. Quote, just days after Flynn talked to the Russian ambassador, McFarland said that her memory was clear and that Flynn and the Russian official had never discussed sanctions. Quote, early on the morning of January 13th, 2017, McFarland phoned one of the authors of this article, So one of the two reporters, quote, McFarland insisted in an on-the-record conversation that Flynn and the Russian ambassador had never discussed sanctions. McFarland said that Flynn, quote, called me right after his call with Kislyak and conveyed the details of their conversation. So KT McFarland knew that Flynn talked to Russia about sanctions. KT McFarland lied publicly about whether the incoming Trump administration was talking to Russia about sanctions. She lied publicly about it. She lied on the record to reporters about it. She lied to the U.S. Senate about it. She lied to the FBI about it. But then they apparently forgave her when she said, oh, it was so long ago, I forgot, maybe. Mike Flynn also lied about those conversations he had with Russia talking about sanctions. He lied in public. He lied to reporters. He lied to the FBI. Why were they lying about it? I mean, on its face, they didn't need to. It would make sense that they'd be talking about sanctions to the Russian government. Conceivably, they're the top two national security officials in the National Security Council for the incoming administration. Obviously, there's going to be a change of policy on that matter. It's not that weird, but they lied about it. And the fact that they were lying about it meant that those two senior Trump administration officials, the number one and number two officials at the National Security Council under this new president, they were both compromised by Russia. From the very beginning, from the transition. Because, of course, Russia knew the truth, right? Russia was on the other end of the phone. They knew that these guys had been having conversations about Russia. Right? It wasn't secret from Russia, but it was being kept secret from the American public, the American press, the American Congress, and even the FBI. And that is called leverage, right? That means Russia compromised them both. Russia was in a position to lord something over the both of them that these two plainly wanted kept a secret because they were lying about it even under oath and even when talking to federal investigators. Why did those two want it secret? Remains unknown. I mean, Trump himself on the campaign trail, he attracted plenty of controversy for talking about sanctions, for his seemingly inexplicable insistence that the U.S. should drop the sanctions against Russia. This, in fact, was the first time Trump talked about sanctions on the campaign trail. It was July 11th, 2015.
I believe I would get along very nicely with Putin, okay? And I mean where we have the strength. I don't think you'd need the sanctions. I think that we would get along very, very well. I really believe that.
That's the first time Trump talked about sanctions on Russia as a soon-to-be presidential candidate. I don't think you need the sanctions. And David Korn and Michael Isikoff's book, Russian Roulette, they pointed out who exactly asked that question of Trump. Who teed him up at that event in Las Vegas in July 2015 to pronounce publicly that the U.S. should drop sanctions on Russia? It was this person.
Okay, let's go.
Sorry?
Yes, ma'am.
From Russia. So my question will be about foreign politics.
Okay.
If you would be elected as a president, what will be your foreign politics, especially in the relationships with my country? And do you want to continue the politics of sanctions that are damaging of both economy, or you have any other ideas?
That, the person who first asked Trump as a presidential candidate about sanctions on Russia, prompting Trump for the first time ever to publicly say, hey, let's get rid of sanctions on Russia. That is Maria Butina, who is now famous. She is now in federal custody on charges that she is a secret agent of the Russian government, who was sent here to influence the U.S. election in order to benefit the government of Russia. It was a weird thing at the time for Trump, alone among Republicans and Democrats and everyone, to come out and say, we should drop sanctions on Russia. Right? It was weird at the time in itself. It is weird in a whole new way. Now that we know, it turns out to have been an alleged secret agent of the Russian government who set him up to publicly do that in the first place. But while he at least was willing to advocate publicly for dropping the sanctions on Russia, what he was lying about at the time, what he was refusing to acknowledge at the time, was that if the U.S. government actually did that, actually did drop sanctions on Russia, that would be a huge personal financial windfall for him. Because now we know that Trump and his business at that time were secretly negotiating a gigantic business deal in Moscow, a Trump Tower Moscow that would be financed to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars by a Russian bank, a bank specifically that was under U.S. sanctions. So if it's a sanctioned bank, Americans can't do business involving that bank. Trump took this weird outlier political stance that he wanted to drop sanctions on Russia. He just conveniently didn't mention his personal involvement in a gigantic real estate scheme that could only go ahead if the U.S. dropped sanctions. I mean, Trump knew that at the time, although he lied about it repeatedly, insisted over and over again that he had no business interest in Russia whatsoever. But Trump knew that he did, and Russia knew that he did. I mean, the Kremlin, we now know, was actively involved in discussions with the Trump Organization about the financing, about the building project. According to BuzzFeed, even about Putin's personal sweetener in the deal, which would be a free $50 million penthouse that he could keep for himself in the deal, free for nothing. So Trump knew this was in the works, but was keeping it secret. The Kremlin knew it was in the works. They knew that Trump was keeping it secret. They even helped him keep it secret. In a call with reporters, the senior Kremlin official who was apparently managing this project for the Russian government, he put out a statement denying any Kremlin involvement. He said, "We don't respond to such business topics. It is not our job." Asked specifically about reports that Michael Cohen had emailed this official's office in the Kremlin about the project, this Russian official, Dmitry Peskov, responded, quote, "We left that without a response." Well, from Michael Cohen's plea in court yesterday, we know that Peskov's office actually did reply to him. So that means that the Kremlin was helping cover this thing up, too. Just step back from this a second, right? This means, yes, during the transition, the top two national security aides in the incoming Trump administration were compromised by Russia. Russia had leverage over them because of them lying about their dealings with Russia. But also, as a presidential candidate, Trump was definitely, we now know, compromised by Russia. He was lying about his dealings with Russia, and Russia knew it, and Russia was helping him to keep the secret. Right? So this is bad. We've got a presidential candidate, for one thing, offering a $50 million gift. It's a gift to a foreign leader, secretly. So he's compromised on that, right? They can expose him for that if they want to. Russia has also compromised him because he is lying about this ongoing business pursuit in Russia, and Russia's plan to provide him hundreds of millions of dollars for that real estate project if he gets those sanctions lifted. He's lying about that. He's not mentioning his personal stake in the sanctions issue when he's talking about sanctions. So Russia has him compromised on that, too. I mean, the secret Moscow deal is damning enough. It's damning enough that a criminal cover-up effort is launched that includes the president's lawyer, at least him, lying to Congress under oath about the deal. Congressman Jim Himes from the Intelligence Committee was here last night and told us that it might not just be Michael Cohen who was in on the cover-up. Congressman Himes telling us last night that among multiple witnesses who came before the Intelligence Committee under oath, there were not a lot of inconsistencies on the issue of Trump Tower Moscow, meaning a lot of people under oath before the Intelligence Committee told the same story as Michael Cohen. And Michael Cohen just pled guilty to a felony because his story was a lie. If other people were telling the same lie about the secret Moscow deal, if other people were organized so that they would all tell the same lie, all of those people will not only be in trouble themselves, and soon, since the transcripts of their testimony are going to Mueller as soon as the Democrats are sworn in. But if there was anybody who coached or orchestrated that cover-up so they'd all say the same thing, well, that's a heck of a lot worse, right? Who was in a position to do that? Well, now here's how this whole thing all fits together, which is bad. In the criminal information filed alongside Michael Cohen's guilty plea yesterday, the special counsel's office says that the Trump Tower Moscow project involved direct contact with the Kremlin. It involved plans for Trump Organization personnel, including potentially Trump himself, to visit Moscow and meet with senior government officials, very senior Russian government officials. The criminal information also says that the project also involved more consultations with Trump himself than had previously been admitted to. But it also says that the project went along for months longer than had previously been admitted to. It went all the way into the summer of 2016, after Trump had wrapped up the Republican primaries and become the presumptive Republican nominee. So it went on for months longer than they had previously admitted. But then the way the special counsel tells it in the Cohen court filings, it did come to a rather dramatic and specific halt on a specific date, on June 14th, 2016. The two Trump Organization guys, Michael Cohen and Felix Sater, who were working on the Trump Tower Moscow project, they met in the lobby of Trump Tower on June 14th, 2016. And on that date, Cohen told Sater, "I'm not going to Moscow." June 14th. That date is in Mueller's filing along with Cohen's guilty plea, June 14th, 2016, which is the day that the Washington Post published the first national news story exposing the fact that Russian government hackers had broken into the Democratic Party's headquarters and started to steal stuff. Felix Sater himself affirmed to NBC News last night that that story, the story about Russian government hackers being exposed for their role in trying to get into our elections, that was the reason they stopped working on the Trump Tower project that day. This secret project they'd been working on for many, many, many months, including direct contact with the Kremlin and planned travel to Moscow, and stopped that day. Why? What was the connection between those two things? What's the connection between Russia basically burglarizing the presidential election to help Trump and the big real estate deal Trump was secretly working on in Russia during the campaign? Why does one have to stop when the other one gets exposed? Well, what if they're both the same project? The person in the Kremlin who is working with the Trump organization to facilitate the Moscow real estate deal is Dmitry Peskov, on the right there with Vladimir Putin. Peskov goes so far as to personally lie to the press to keep the Moscow deal a secret, to keep Trump secret for him, while Trump is lying about it to the American public. Peskov is also suspected of having a major role, perhaps even the chief executive role, in the campaign to interfere in the elections, to help Clinton to hurt Clinton and help her opponent. I mean, if the big picture Russian dream here is to have their very own president of the USA, if their dream is to compromise an American presidential candidate so that candidate is beholden to them, and then install that compromised candidate as president, then the Trump Tower Moscow project, which compromises Trump, and the election interference campaign, which is designed to install him, those are the same op. Compromise your guy, then install your compromised guy. World domination in 2 easy steps. Of course, in order for the Moscow deal to even seem viable, though, you would need to free up the financing that would make the whole thing possible. And this Russian state-controlled bank, VTB, is committed to financing the project. That's who's going to finance the thing. So the thing you need is for them to be allowed to finance the project. And in order for them to finance the project, they need to not be sanctioned. So you need your compromised U.S. presidential candidate and then ultimately his administration to get that done for you, to get rid of the sanctions. Right? That's the gear that makes the whole wheel spin. And so Trump publicly advocates that when prompted by someone who is now in custody as an alleged Russian agent. Mike Flynn and KT McFarland secretly start working on it, including with the Russian government, and then they lie about it publicly and to the press and to the Congress and even to the FBI. Sanctions advocacy isn't such a terrible thing for them to be doing as a standalone thing. But if it was part of this kind of scheme, then yeah, maybe that would explain why they were being so surreptitious about it. And what else? Well, we also now know that the two Trump organization guys who themselves specifically were the ones working on Trump Tower Moscow, Felix Sater and Michael Cohen, they ended up themselves, the two of them, involved in one more scheme right before Mike Flynn was fired, right at the start of the Trump administration. They were involved in a scheme to cook up yet another plan to get rid of Russian sanctions. Do you remember the story? Felix Sater and Michael Cohen involved in the supposed secret Ukrainian peace deal scheme, which was really just a proposal to give Ukraine over to Russia and then drop the Russian sanctions anyway. What were Felix Sater and Michael Cohen doing working on something like that? Do Felix Sater and Michael Cohen scream international diplomacy and peacemaking to you? Those guys wouldn't even say that about themselves. But yeah, it was those guys working on this plan to drop Russian sanctions. Because those guys were the ones who were making the Trump Moscow project happen too. And to make that come true, it would need financing from that Russian state-owned bank controlled by Putin, and that couldn't happen until U.S. sanctions on Russia were dropped. So the real estate guys start working on dropping sanctions in Russia, because it's part of their deal. Because sanctions and a huge financial deal for Trump, and lying publicly about the deal for Trump, and lying about contacts with the Russian government, it's all one thing. And it may have even all been run by the same guy, Dmitry Peskov, in the Russian government. And so on Tuesday, Mike Flynn will be in court, and we will learn what Robert Mueller has come to know in his dealings with Mike Flynn, since Flynn pled guilty to lying to the FBI about sanctions a year ago. Right before Flynn comes to court, we have finally learned the answer to the biggest mystery about the case against him: why he bothered to lie about those sanctions discussions in the first place. It wouldn't have needed to be surreptitious if it was just about sanctions alone. But Mike Flynn and his deputy, KT McFarland, and the president himself, we now know they were all compromised by Russia at the time because of what they were lying about that Russia knew the truth about. And what Russia knew the truth about was what turns out to be a fairly simple plan. Compromise the candidate with promises of a secret deal. Install the candidate, and then leverage the candidate to lift sanctions and free Russia to do what it wants. Now, over this past week, we suddenly can see the full plan and how it was supposed to work. The question is whether it might still work now that it's out in the open, or whether they're caught and it's therefore over.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.